It took 17 months of sleeping 3 hours a night, surviving on instant coffee and determination, for Marcus Chen to create what billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies couldn't. In his cluttered garage workshop, surrounded by circuit boards salvaged from old computers and medical journals borrowed from the library, he built hope. Not for profit, not for recognition, but for two 8-year-old boys who hadn't spoken a word to each other in their entire lives. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of medical research, test the limits of a father's love, and prove that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from corporate boardrooms, but from broken hearts that refuse to give up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Marcus Chen's garage, casting long shadows across a landscape of electronic chaos. Wires snaked between workbenches like digital ivy, and the air hummed with the soft buzz of cooling fans and the occasional beep of diagnostic equipment. This wasn't the sterile environment of a research laboratory or the polished floors of a medical facility. This was desperation given form, necessity carved from nothing. Marcus stood hunched over a breadboard, his weathered hands moving with surgical precision as he soldered a connection no thicker than a human hair. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent chasing a breakthrough that seemed to dance just beyond his fingertips. His black hair, now streaked with premature silver, fell across his forehead as he worked. At 34, he looked a decade older, worn thin by months of 18-hour days and the crushing weight of hope deferred. The device before him was deceptively simple in appearance. About the size of a smartphone, with a smooth titanium surface interrupted only by a small LED display and two nearly invisible sensors. But within its modest frame-lay technology that had consumed every dollar of his savings, every favor he could call in, and every moment of his waking life for the past year and a half, behind him, the garage door that led into the house remained slightly ajar. Through it came the familiar sounds of morning chaos, the clatter of breakfast dishes, the gentle murmur of his wife Sarah's voice, and something else. Something that made his chest tighten every time he heard it. Silence where there should have been children's laughter. The absence of voices where twin boys should have been chattering about cartoons or arguing over toys. Daniel and David Chin were 8 years old, identical in almost every way except for a small scar above David's left eyebrow from a fall when he was 3. They shared the same dark eyes, the same serious expression, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. But they existed in separate worlds, islands of consciousness that had never quite learned to build bridges to each other or to anyone else. Both boys had been diagnosed with severe autism spectrum disorder when they were barely 2 years old. The doctors had used words like profound communication deficits and significant sensory processing challenges, clinical terms that felt like stones in Marcus's throat every time he heard them. They explained that the twins might never speak, might never engage meaningfully with the world around them, might always remain locked inside themselves. Marcus had nodded politely at those appointments, had shaken hands with specialists, and collected pamphlets about therapeutic interventions and support groups. But privately he had made a different decision. He would not accept that verdict, not for his sons. The morning routine began, as it always did, with Sarah coaxing the boys through breakfast while Marcus cleaned up his workspace. Through the open door he could see David sitting at the kitchen table, methodically arranging his cereal into perfect rows, each piece precisely aligned. Meanwhile, Daniel stood by the window, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass, lost in a world of geometric designs that only he could see. They were beautiful children, Marcus thought, watching them through the doorway. Brilliant in ways that standardized tests could never measure. David could solve complex puzzles that frustrated adults, his spatial reasoning skills remarkable even by neurotypical standards. Daniel had an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns, able to predict sequences and relationships that others missed entirely. But they couldn't tell their parents when they were hungry, or scared, or happy. They couldn't ask for help when they needed it. And most heartbreaking of all, they seemed utterly unaware of each other's existence. Despite sharing the same face, the same DNA, the same bedroom, Marcus had been a biomedical engineer before the boys were born, working for a mid-sized medical device company that developed diagnostic equipment for hospitals. The pay had been decent, the work engaging enough, and the future had seemed secure. But after the diagnosis, everything changed. He began spending his evenings researching autism, diving deep into neurological studies and sensory processing theories. He attended conferences on his vacation days, reached out to researchers, and slowly began to understand the complex interplay of factors that created the unique challenges his sons faced. The more he learned, the more frustrated he became with the existing therapeutic approaches. Behavioral therapy was helpful but slow. Medication could address some symptoms but came with significant side effects. Communication devices were clunky and often overwhelming for children with sensory sensitivities. Everything seemed designed for the convenience of caregivers rather than the actual needs of autistic individuals. That's when Marcus began to dream of something different. Something that could work with the brain rather than against it. That could amplify natural abilities rather than trying to force conformity to neurotypical standards. The idea started small, just a theoretical framework he sketched in notebooks late at night. But as the months passed, it grew into something more concrete, more urgent. The breakthrough moment had come during a particularly difficult evening 6 months earlier. David was having a meltdown, overwhelmed by the sensory chaos of a family gathering, while Daniel sat in the corner, rocking gently and humming a tune that only he could hear. Marcus watched his sons, so close physically but so far apart emotionally, and suddenly understood something fundamental about their condition. They weren't broken. They were processing information differently, experiencing the world through a lens that filtered and interpreted sensory input in unique ways. The problem wasn't their brains. The problem was that the world wasn't designed for brains like theirs. That night, Marcus began designing what he would later call the Neural Bridge Protocol. It was ambitious beyond anything he had attempted before, a device that could read the subtle electrical patterns of brain activity and translate them into a form that others could understand. Not just words, but emotions, intentions, the rich inner life that existed beneath the surface of nonverbal communication. The science was complex, built on recent advances in non-invasive neural monitoring and machine learning algorithms. But the principle was elegant in its simplicity. Every human brain generated electrical patterns when processing thoughts and emotions. These patterns were as unique as fingerprints, but they followed recognizable templates. If you could read these patterns accurately enough, you could potentially translate them into conventional language. For neurotypical individuals, this translation happened naturally through speech and body language. But for many autistic individuals, that translation process was disrupted or functioned differently. Marcus's device would serve as an external translator, reading the neural patterns and converting them into words, images, or even music. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story that others could understand. The first prototype had been crude, assembled from components he ordered online and software he wrote himself during sleepless nights. It barely worked, producing more gibberish than communication. But occasionally, just occasionally, it would capture something genuine. A moment of frustration from David would appear on the screen as too loud, too bright. Daniel's fascination with a butterfly would translate to flying pattern, beautiful mathematics. Those early successes were enough to keep Marcus going. He quit his job, despite Sarah's worried protests, and threw himself into development full-time. They lived off their savings and her part-time income as a freelance graphic designer, cutting every corner they could to keep the project alive. The device evolved rapidly. Marcus learned to filter out background neural noise, to distinguish between different types of thoughts and emotions, to translate abstract concepts into concrete language. He tested it on himself first, then on Sarah, refining the algorithms until the translations became increasingly accurate and nuanced. But the real test would be with Daniel and David. Getting them to wear the device was challenge enough, given their sensory sensitivities. The first few attempts were disasters, with both boys rejecting the unfamiliar sensation of the neural sensors. Marcus had to redesign the interface multiple times, making it lighter, softer, less intrusive. The first successful session had been with David. The device was reading his neural patterns while he worked on one of his favorite puzzles, a three-dimensional maze that had stumped everyone else in the family. For the first 10 minutes, the translations were basic. Focus, pattern, solution near. But then something shifted. Father watching appeared on the screen. Father proud feeling. David, happy father proud. Marcus had stared at those words, hardly believing what he was seeing. His son, who had never spoken a word, was not only aware of his presence, but was responding to his emotional state. The breakthrough was more profound than he had dared to hope. The sessions with Daniel proved equally revelatory. Where David's thoughts were structured and methodical, Daniel's were poetic and impressionistic. When music played in the background, the device would translate his neural patterns into phrases like sound colors dancing and, quote, harmony mathematics infinite. When he was upset, it would show world too sharp, needs soft quiet. But the most extraordinary moment came during a session when both boys were in the room together. Marcus had been working with David on the puzzle while Daniel drew at a nearby table. Suddenly, both devices began registering unusual activity. David's screen showed brother drawing music, while Daniel's displayed brother thinking maze paths. They were aware of each other, not just physically present in the same space, but genuinely conscious of each other's mental activities. The twins who had seemed so isolated were actually deeply connected, their minds somehow attuned to frequencies that others couldn't perceive. That discovery changed everything. Marcus realized that his device wasn't just a communication aid. It was a window into a form of consciousness that the world had barely begun to understand. His sons weren't just nonverbal. They were speaking a language that no one else had learned to hear. The implications were staggering. If the neural bridge protocol could work for Daniel and David, it could potentially help thousands of other autistic individuals. Children who had been written off as severely impaired might actually be brilliant thinkers trapped by communication barriers. Families who had lost hope might discover that their loved ones had been trying to reach them all along. But developing the technology was only part of the challenge. Manufacturing it would require resources that Marcus simply didn't have. The specialized components alone cost more than most families could afford, and the software needed constant updates and refinements. To make the neural bridge protocol accessible to everyone who needed it, Marcus would need partners with deep pockets and distribution networks. That's when he made the decision that would change his family's life forever. He would approach the major medical device companies, the pharmaceutical giants who had the resources to bring his invention to the world. Surely they would see the potential, the humanitarian value of a technology that could transform millions of lives. He was about to learn that in the world of medical technology, humanitarian value was often the least important consideration. The rejection letters began arriving within weeks of his first round of inquiries. Polite but firm dismissals from companies that thanked him for his interest, but explained that his proposal didn't align with their current strategic priorities. Some were more blunt, questioning whether there was sufficient market demand for such a specialized device. Marcus tried to stay optimistic. Maybe he just hadn't found the right company yet, or perhaps his presentation needed refinement. He revised his proposal, created more detailed technical specifications, and gathered additional data from his sessions with the twins. The next round of submissions was more targeted, focused on companies that already worked in the neurological space. The responses were similar. Rejection, sometimes accompanied by suggestions that he consider licensing his technology to them for a nominal fee, with no guarantee of development or distribution. A few companies requested in-person meetings, which gave Marcus hope until he realized they were more interested in understanding his methods than in partnership. One particularly frustrating meeting was with Synapse Dynamics, a major player in neurological medical devices. Marcus had driven 4 hours to their corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass tower that spoke of success and infinite resources. He was ushered into a conference room where 3 executives in expensive suits listened politely as he demonstrated the neural bridge protocol using recordings from his sessions with the twins. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The lead executive, a woman named Victoria Marsh, leaned forward with obvious interest. "This is remarkable work, Mr. Chen. The applications could be enormous, not just for autism, but for stroke recovery, traumatic brain injury, even early-stage dementia." Marcus felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone who understood the potential. But then came the conditions. Synapse Dynamics would be willing to partner with him, but they would need exclusive rights to the technology. They would handle all development, manufacturing, and distribution decisions. Marcus would receive a one-time payment and a small percentage of future profits, with no input into how the device was marketed or priced. "We're talking about a very niche market," Victoria explained. "The development and regulatory costs will be enormous. We'll need to position this as a premium therapeutic device, probably priced in the $50,000 to $100,000 range per unit." Marcus felt his excitement evaporate. That's completely out of reach for most families dealing with autism. The whole point is to make this accessible. Victoria smiled sympathetically. "I understand your idealism, Mr. Chen, but we have shareholders to consider. Medical devices are expensive to develop and manufacture. The price point reflects the value provided." Quote, "The value is helping children communicate with their families," Marcus replied, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't put a price on that." "Actually," Victoria said, her smile becoming cooler, "we can. And we do. That's how the medical device industry works." Marcus left that meeting with a sick feeling in his stomach. Every subsequent conversation with other companies followed similar patterns. They loved the technology, but wanted to control it completely, to price it beyond the reach of the families who needed it most, to turn his labor of love into another expensive medical gadget available only to the wealthy. The months passed, and Marcus's savings dwindled. He had to sell his car and take on freelance engineering projects to keep the family afloat, while continuing to develop the neural bridge protocol. Sarah picked up additional graphic design work, and they cut expenses to the bone. The stress was taking its toll on everyone, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to give up. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a developmental neurologist at the Regional Children's Hospital, had heard about Marcus's work through mutual connections in the autism community. She reached out not as a representative of any company, but as a researcher who had spent her career working with autistic children. Their first meeting was in the hospital cafeteria, a far cry from the corporate conference rooms Marcus had grown used to. Dr. Rodriguez was in her early 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that lit up with genuine curiosity as Marcus explained his work. "I've seen a lot of communication devices over the years," she said, "but nothing like this. The real-time neural translation is revolutionary. Have you published any research?" Marcus shook his head. "I've been focused on development and trying to find a commercial partner. I hadn't considered academic publication." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. "That might be your best path forward. If you can document the efficacy with proper clinical trials, it becomes much harder for companies to ignore or suppress the technology. Academic credibility has a way of forcing corporate attention." She offered to help design a formal study, bringing scientific rigor to Marcus's work while maintaining his control over the technology. It was the first time in months that Marcus felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The clinical trial took 6 months to organize and another year to complete. Working with Dr. Rodriguez's team, Marcus tested the neural bridge protocol with 20 autistic children of varying ages and communication abilities. The results were extraordinary. 18 of the 20 participants showed significant improvement in their ability to communicate complex thoughts and emotions. Several children who had never spoken began using the device to engage in conversations with their families for the first time. But the most remarkable results came from pairs of autistic siblings. Like Daniel and David, these children showed an unusual ability to connect with each other through the device, suggesting that autism might involve forms of communication that neurotypical individuals simply couldn't perceive. The research paper that emerged from the study was groundbreaking. Dr. Rodriguez presented it at the International Conference on Autism Research, where it generated enormous interest and media attention. Suddenly, Marcus found himself fielding calls from reporters, researchers, and, yes, medical device companies. But this time the dynamic was different. The academic validation gave Marcus leverage he hadn't possessed before. The technology was no longer an unknown quantity from a desperate father. It was proven, peer-reviewed, and backed by one of the most respected neurologists in the field. The first call came from Meridian Medical, a company Marcus had approached unsuccessfully 2 years earlier. They were suddenly very interested in partnership discussions, though their terms remained problematic. Marcus politely declined, as he did with the next 3 companies that reached out. Then came the call that would change everything. It wasn't from a medical device company at all, but from the Hawthorne Foundation, a private foundation focused on technological solutions for neurological conditions. They had read Dr. Rodriguez's research and were interested in something very different from a traditional corporate partnership. "We don't want to buy your technology, Mr. Chen," explained the Foundation's director James Hawthorne during their first phone conversation. "We want to help you give it away." The Foundation's proposal was unlike anything Marcus had encountered. They would provide funding for large-scale manufacturing, regulatory, approval, and distribution, but with the explicit goal of making the Neural Bridge protocol available at cost to any family that needed it. Wealthy families would pay market rates, but sliding-scale pricing would ensure that no child was excluded due to financial constraints. It seemed too good to be true, and Marcus's experiences with the medical device industry had taught him to be skeptical of promises that sounded too generous. But as he researched the Hawthorne Foundation, he discovered a track record of exactly this kind of work. They had funded the development and distribution of low-cost diagnostic devices for rare diseases, communication aids for stroke victims, and mobility devices for children with physical disabilities. The Foundation's approach was refreshingly straightforward. They would provide the resources Marcus needed, while allowing him to maintain control over the technology and its distribution. Their only requirement was transparency, regular reporting on how the devices were being used, and what outcomes they were achieving. But as Marcus prepared to sign the partnership agreement, he began to notice strange things happening around him. His email was hacked, with someone attempting to access his research files. His phone received mysterious calls that hung up when he answered. Most troubling of all, he began to see the same unfamiliar car parked on his street at different times of day. The harassment escalated quickly. Someone broke into his garage workshop, though nothing was stolen. Instead, his equipment had been tampered with, delicate calibrations disrupted, and backup drives corrupted. The message was clear. Someone didn't want the Neural Bridge protocol to reach the market, at least not on Marcus's terms. The revelation of who was behind the interference came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rodriguez called Marcus late one evening, her voice tight with anger and concern. "I just got off the phone with a colleague at Synapse Dynamics," she said. "Apparently, there's been some internal discussion about your technology. They're not happy about your partnership with the Hawthorne Foundation." Marcus felt a chill. What kind of discussion? The kind where they're exploring legal options to claim ownership of the Neural Bridge protocol. They're arguing that since you used some publicly available research that their scientists contributed to, they have intellectual property claims on your work. The legal threat was almost laughably weak, but Marcus knew that didn't matter. Large corporations could tie up small inventors in court for years, bleeding them dry through legal fees even if they ultimately lost. Synapse Dynamics had the resources to fight a prolonged battle. Marcus did not. But Dr. Rodriguez had more information. "There's something else. My colleague mentioned that this isn't just about your device. Apparently, several companies have been collaborating to suppress competing technologies in the autism communication space. They want to maintain control over the market, keep prices high, and prevent innovations that might disrupt their business model." The conspiracy was larger than Marcus had imagined. The medical device industry had developed a sophisticated system for identifying and neutralizing threats to their profit margins. Independent inventors like Marcus were particularly vulnerable, as they lacked the resources to fight back against coordinated corporate pressure. That night, as Marcus sat in his garage workshop surrounded by the fruits of 2 years of desperate labor, he felt the weight of impossible odds pressing down on him. On one side were his sons, brilliant children trapped by communication barriers that his technology could dissolve. On the other side was an industry worth billions of dollars, willing to crush anyone who threatened their control over medical innovation. The device on his workbench beeped softly, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. It was running a diagnostic cycle, checking its neural sensors and calibrating its translation algorithms. In a few hours, he would test it, again with Daniel and David, capturing their thoughts and emotions, giving them voices that the world could finally hear. Marcus picked up the device, feeling its weight in his hands. Such a small thing to carry such enormous hopes. Tomorrow, he would make a decision that would determine not just his family's future, but potentially the futures of thousands of other families dealing with autism. He thought about Victoria Marsh and her cold smile, about the broken computers and corrupted files, about the car that had been watching his house. Then he thought about David's face the first time the device had translated his thoughts, the wonder and joy of finally being understood. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Marcus Chen had built hope in his garage, and no amount of corporate pressure would make him abandon it now. But he was about to learn that hope, once unleashed, could be as dangerous as any weapon. The Neural Bridge Protocol was going to change the world. The only question was whether Marcus would survive long enough to see it happen. The morning that everything changed began like any other, with Marcus hunched over his workbench while the twins went through their breakfast routine in the kitchen. But today was different. Today was the day he planned to demonstrate the Neural Bridge Protocol to James Hawthorne and the Foundation Board. The presentation that would either secure the future of his technology or mark the end of 2 years of desperate work. Sarah appeared in the garage doorway, coffee mug in hand, her face showing the strain of months of financial uncertainty and sleepless nights. "The boys are asking for you," she said softly. "Well, Daniel is humming that tune he only hums when he wants your attention, and David keeps looking toward the garage." Marcus smiled despite his anxiety. Even without words, his sons had developed their own ways of communicating needs and desires. The Neural Bridge Protocol had helped him understand these subtle signals, revealing the rich emotional lives hidden beneath their silence. "I'll be right there," he said, powering down his testing equipment. "Just need to run final diagnostics on the presentation unit." Sarah stepped closer, studying the device that had consumed their lives for so long. It looked so ordinary, she thought, like an oversized smartphone or a small tablet. Nothing about its appearance suggested the revolutionary technology contained within. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. Marcus looked up from his work, meeting her eyes. "I have to be. This is our only chance to get the Neural Bridge Protocol to the families who need it. If the Foundation doesn't fund us, I don't know what we'll do next." They both knew the alternatives. Marcus could go back to his old job, assuming his former employer would have him after a 2-year absence. The Neural Bridge Protocol would become another brilliant idea that never reached the people it was meant to help, gathering dust in a garage while autistic children continued to struggle with communication barriers that could be overcome. The presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the Foundation's offices downtown. Marcus had prepared meticulously, creating video demonstrations of the device working with Daniel and David, charts showing the clinical trial results, and projections for manufacturing and distribution costs. Everything was designed to show that the Neural Bridge Protocol wasn't just scientifically sound, but practically viable. At noon, as Marcus was loading his materials into Sarah's car, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. "Mr. Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, with an underlying coldness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "This is Victoria Marsh from Synapse Dynamics. I believe we met about a year ago to discuss your communication device." Marcus remembered the meeting vividly, particularly Victoria's dismissive attitude and her company's attempt to lowball him for exclusive rights to his technology. "I remember. What can I do for you?" "I'm calling to offer you one final opportunity to reconsider our partnership proposal," Victoria said. "We're prepared to be significantly more generous than our previous offer." "I'm not interested," Marcus replied. "I've found a partner who shares my vision for making this technology accessible." There was a pause, and when Victoria spoke again, her voice carried a subtle threat. "Mr. Chen, I don't think you fully understand the complexities of bringing a medical device to market. The regulatory hurdles alone can destroy even the most promising technologies. Companies like ours have relationships with the FDA, with testing laboratories, with the medical establishment. Without those relationships, well, let's just say that many brilliant inventions never see the light of day." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you of market realities," Victoria said smoothly. "The medical device industry is complicated, Mr. Chen. There are many ways for promising technologies to encounter unexpected obstacles. Patent challenges, safety concerns raised by anonymous sources, regulatory delays that can stretch for years. It would be unfortunate if your device encountered such problems, especially when they could be easily avoided through the right partnership." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stared at his phone, hands shaking slightly. The message was clear. Partner with Synapse Dynamics on their terms, or face systematic sabotage of his technology. But Marcus had come too far to be intimidated now. He thought about Daniel and David, about the other children in Dr. Rodriguez's study who had found their voices through his device, about the thousands of families who could benefit if the neural bridge protocol reached the market. No amount of corporate bullying would make him abandon them. The drive to the Foundation offices took 20 minutes through midday traffic. Marcus used the time to review his presentation notes and try to calm his nerves. Everything he had worked for came down to the next 2 hours. If he could convince the Hawthorne Foundation to fund the neural bridge protocol, it would become virtually unstoppable. Even Synapse Dynamics couldn't interfere with a well-funded, legally protected development program. The Foundation's building was modest compared to the corporate towers Marcus had visited, a renovated warehouse in an arts district that spoke of practical purpose rather than ostentatious wealth. Inside, the offices were simple but comfortable, with natural light streaming through large windows and walls lined with photos of the medical devices and technologies the Foundation had helped bring to market. James Hawthorne met Marcus in the lobby, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades turning good ideas into reality. "Mr. Chen, it's a pleasure to finally meet in person," Hawthorne said, extending his hand. "I've been looking forward to this demonstration ever since Dr. Rodriguez shared your research with us." They were joined by 3 other Foundation board members: Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatric neurologist, Robert Walsh, a former medical device executive who had left the corporate world to focus on humanitarian technology, and Maria Santos, a disability rights advocate whose teenage son had autism. The presentation began in a small conference room equipped with projection equipment and comfortable seating. Marcus had prepared extensively, but he found himself speaking from the heart as much as from his notes. 2 years ago, my twin sons were diagnosed with severe autism, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. The specialist told us they might never speak, never engage meaningfully with the world around them. I refused to accept that verdict. He showed videos of Daniel and David before the neural bridge protocol, silent children who seemed lost in their own worlds. Then came the recordings of their first successful sessions with the device, their thoughts and emotions finally given voice. "This isn't just about education," Marcus explained as the board members watched David's translated thoughts appear on screen. "It's about recognizing that autism doesn't mean the absence of intelligence or emotion. It means thinking and feeling in ways that our society hasn't learned to understand." The clinical trial data was compelling. Dr. Rodriguez had documented significant improvements in communication abilities across nearly all participants. But more importantly, the device had revealed the depth and complexity of autistic thinking, challenging fundamental assumptions about the condition. Maria Santos leaned forward, tears in her eyes. "My son Miguel has been nonverbal for 15 years. Are you telling me that this device could help him communicate with us?" Marcus nodded. "If Miguel's autism involves the kind of communication barriers we've studied, then yes, there's an excellent chance the neural bridge protocol could help him find his voice." The questions that followed were detailed and probing, but Marcus could sense genuine enthusiasm from the board. James Hawthorne was particularly interested in the manufacturing and distribution challenges, asking pointed questions about cost control and quality assurance. "Our goal is to make this technology available to every family that needs it," Marcus explained. "Wealthy families can pay market rates, but no child should be excluded because of financial constraints. The sliding scale pricing model ensures accessibility while maintaining the quality and support services that families deserve." Robert Walsh nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of approach the Foundation was created to support. Too many medical innovations price themselves out of reach of the people who need them most." The formal presentation lasted an hour, but the discussion continued for another 90 minutes as board members explored technical details and implementation strategies. Marcus found himself energized by their questions, their obvious understanding of both the technology and its humanitarian potential. Finally, James Hawthorne called for a brief recess while the board discussed their decision in private. Marcus waited in the lobby, trying to contain his anxiety as he watched the minutes tick by. Everything depended on the next few minutes. When the board reconvened, their expressions were unreadable. James Hawthorne spoke first. "Mr. Chen, the board has reviewed your presentation and proposal carefully. We're impressed by both the technology and your commitment to accessibility. However, we do have some concerns. Marcus felt his heart sink. What kind of concerns? We've heard rumors about pressure from certain medical device companies, Dr. Kim said gently. Companies that might not appreciate competition in this space. Are you prepared to deal with potential legal challenges or other forms of interference? Marcus thought about Victoria Marsh's phone call, about the break-ins and harassment his family had already endured. I'm aware of the risks, he said. But I'm not going to let corporate bullying prevent this technology from reaching the children who need it. Maria Santos smiled. That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. James Hawthorne leaned forward. The Hawthorne Foundation is prepared to offer full funding for the Neural Bridge Protocol development, manufacturing, and distribution program. We're talking about a 3-year, $15 million commitment, with options for additional funding based on outcomes. Marcus felt the room spin slightly. $15 million. It was more money than he had dared to hope for, enough to bring the Neural Bridge Protocol to market on a massive scale, while maintaining the accessibility that was so important to him. There are conditions, Hawthorne continued. First, you'll need to establish a formal company with proper legal and financial structures. Second, we'll require regular reporting and oversight to ensure the technology is being developed and distributed according to our shared values. Third, and most importantly, you'll need to be prepared for the fight that's coming. What kind of fight? Marcus asked. Robert Walsh answered. The kind where billion-dollar companies use every legal and regulatory tool at their disposal to prevent competition. We've seen it before with other technologies we've funded. The medical device industry doesn't like disruption, and they're very good at making life difficult for innovators who threaten their profit margins. But, James Hawthorne added with a slight smile, the Foundation has considerable experience dealing with corporate pressure. We have excellent legal counsel, relationships with regulatory agencies, and a network of allies in the medical community. Most importantly, we have something that corporations fear: public attention and moral authority. The contract negotiations took another 2 hours, but by the end of the day, Marcus had signed agreements that would transform the Neural Bridge Protocol from a garage invention into a commercially available medical device. More importantly, the technology would be distributed according to his original vision, accessible to any family regardless of their financial situation. As Marcus drove home that evening, his phone buzzing with congratulatory calls from Dr. Rodriguez and other supporters, he felt a mix of elation and apprehension. The Foundation's funding would make his dreams possible, but it would also make him a much bigger target for the corporate interests that opposed his work. That night, as he sat in his garage workshop for what might be the last time as a desperate inventor, rather than the head of a funded medical device company, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years ago, he had been a father searching for a way to help his autistic sons communicate. Now he was about to challenge an entire industry's approach to autism treatment. The Neural Bridge Protocol hummed softly on his workbench, its diagnostic cycles running as they had every night for months. Soon, similar devices would be humming in workshops and laboratories around the world, mass-produced and distributed to families who had given up hope of ever hearing their children's voices. But first, Marcus would have to survive the corporate war that was about to begin. And as he would soon discover, when billions of dollars in medical device profits were at stake, some companies were willing to fight very dirty indeed. The attack on Marcus's credibility began subtly, with anonymous posts on social media questioning the validity of his research. Someone with apparent medical credentials suggested that the Neural Bridge Protocol was nothing more than an elaborate placebo effect, that the translations it produced were random noise that desperate parents wanted to believe were their children's thoughts. The posts were sophisticated, written in technical language that sounded authoritative to casual readers. They cited legitimate research papers and raised what seemed like reasonable questions about neural monitoring technology. But Dr. Rodriguez, who had overseen the clinical trials, recognized the coordinated nature of the campaign immediately. "This isn't organic skepticism," she told Marcus during an emergency phone call. "Someone is paying for this. The posts are too well coordinated, too technically sophisticated to be random internet trolling." The online attacks escalated quickly. Soon, autism advocacy websites were flooded with comments suggesting that the neural bridge protocol was exploiting vulnerable families, that Marcus was a charlatan taking advantage of desperate parents. The most damaging posts claimed that the device could actually harm autistic children by forcing them to conform to neurotypical communication patterns. Marcus watched helplessly as months of positive media coverage was systematically undermined. Reporters who had written enthusiastic articles about his work began publishing follow-up pieces filled with doubt and skepticism. Even some autism advocacy groups that had initially supported his research began distancing themselves from the neural bridge protocol. The campaign was brilliant in its cruelty, using the autism community's legitimate concerns about exploitation and forced normalization as weapons against a technology that was actually designed to celebrate and amplify autistic thinking. Someone understood the community's vulnerabilities and was exploiting them ruthlessly. The letter arrived on official letterhead from the Food and Drug Administration, its formal language barely concealing the bureaucratic knife it contained. Marcus stared at the document in his kitchen, Sarah reading over his shoulder while Daniel and David played quietly in the next room, unaware that their father's life work was under systematic assault. Investigation into alleged safety violations regarding unauthorized medical device testing. Sarah read aloud, her voice growing tighter with each word. Immediate cessation of all research activities pending federal review. Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. The FDA complaint had been filed anonymously, but it contained detailed information about the neural bridge protocol that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of his work. Someone had been watching, documenting, preparing for this moment. The timing was surgical in its precision. The foundation funding had been approved, legal structures were being established, and manufacturing partnerships were being negotiated. Now, just as the neural bridge protocol was about to become a reality for thousands of families, federal regulators were stepping in to shut everything down. Dr. Rodriguez arrived within an hour of Marcus's panicked phone call, her face grim as she reviewed the FDA letter. As a practicing physician and researcher, she understood the implications better than anyone. "This is highly unusual," she said, scanning the document again. "The FDA doesn't typically investigate individual researchers unless there's been a serious adverse event or formal complaint from a medical institution. Someone with significant influence pushed this through." The complaint alleged that Marcus had conducted unauthorized medical device testing on vulnerable children, including his own sons, without proper institutional oversight or informed consent. It suggested that the neural bridge protocol might be causing neurological damage that wouldn't be apparent for years. "It's complete fiction," Marcus said, his voice raw with frustration. "Every test was conducted with full parental consent. Your clinical trial followed every ethical guideline. We have documentation for everything." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "I know that, and you know that. But the FDA doesn't know that yet. They have to investigate every complaint, and the process can take months or even years. Whoever filed this knew exactly how to tie us up in regulatory red tape. The investigation would freeze all development work on the neural bridge protocol. Marcus couldn't conduct new tests, couldn't share his research with potential manufacturing partners, couldn't even discuss the technology publicly without risking additional federal scrutiny. His invention, so close to helping thousands of families, was effectively dead in the water. James Hawthorne called that evening, his voice heavy with disappointment and anger. "We've seen this playbook before," he said. "It's a coordinated attack designed to kill promising technologies before they can threaten established market players. The Foundation's legal team is already working on a response, but federal investigations move slowly." "How slowly?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. 18 months. Minimum. More likely 2 to 3 years. And that's if everything goes perfectly, which it rarely does in these cases. Marcus closed his eyes, imagining Daniel and David as 11 or 12-year-olds, still silent, still trapped behind communication barriers that his device could dissolve if only he were allowed to help them. 3 years might as well be forever in the life of a developing child. But the regulatory attack was only the beginning. The next blow came from an unexpected direction, targeting the foundation that had agreed to fund his work. Maria Santos called Marcus at 7 in the morning, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "Someone leaked confidential information about Miguel to the press," she said. "Personal medical records, therapy notes, everything. They're claiming I'm an unfit mother who's exploiting my autistic son for publicity." The article had appeared in a medical industry publication known for its conservative stance on experimental treatments. It painted Maria as a desperate parent willing to subject her disabled child to unproven and potentially dangerous interventions. The piece suggested that her position on the foundation board represented a conflict of interest that compromised her judgment. The attack was devastating in its personal cruelty. Miguel's private struggles were exposed to public scrutiny, his dignity sacrificed to undermine his mother's credibility. The article implied that autistic children were being used as guinea pigs by researchers who cared more about innovation than safety. Within days, similar attacks targeted other foundation board members. Dr. Kim found herself facing questions from her hospital administration about her involvement with controversial experimental research. Robert Walsh was confronted by former colleagues who expressed concern about his association with what they called, quote, fringe autism treatments. The message was clear: anyone who supported the neural bridge protocol would face professional and personal consequences. The medical device industry was leveraging its extensive network of relationships to isolate Marcus and his supporters, turning the autism community against itself through fear and misinformation. James Hawthorne refused to be intimidated, but even he acknowledged the effectiveness of the campaign. "They're not just attacking your technology," he told Marcus during a secure video call. "They're attacking the entire concept of accessible medical innovation. If they can destroy us, it sends a message to every other inventor who might threaten their profit margins." The Foundation's legal team worked around the clock to respond to the FDA complaint and the media attacks, but each day brought new challenges. Patent applications for the neural bridge protocol were challenged by anonymous third parties. Safety concerns were raised by newly created advocacy groups with unclear funding sources. Medical conferences began canceling presentations about autism communication technology, citing concerns about, quote, controversial research practices. Marcus found himself effectively blacklisted from the medical community he had spent years trying to serve. Journals that had been interested in publishing his research suddenly found reasons to delay or reject his submissions. Conference organizers who had invited him to speak quietly withdrew their invitations. Even some autism advocacy groups that had initially supported his work began expressing reservations about the neural bridge protocol. The isolation was crushing, but what devastated Marcus most was watching the impact on his family. Sarah's graphic design clients began canceling contracts, apparently pressured by corporate contacts who disapproved of her husband's work. The twins' school received anonymous complaints about the experimental medical procedures their father was allegedly conducting at home. Most heartbreaking of all, Daniel and David seemed to sense the tension surrounding them. Without the neural bridge protocol sessions that had become part of their routine, they became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. David's puzzle-solving sessions became more frantic and obsessive. Daniel stopped drawing entirely, spending hours staring out the window with an expression of profound sadness. One evening, as Marcus sat in his garage workshop surrounded by the remnants of his dreams, Sarah appeared in the doorway with tears in her eyes. "I found this in Daniel's backpack," she said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing, but unlike Daniel's usual geometric patterns, this one showed recognizable figures. A man sitting alone in a dark room while a family watched from outside, unable to reach him. The image hit Marcus like a physical blow. His son, unable to speak but profoundly perceptive, had captured the essence of their situation with devastating accuracy. The family was being torn apart by forces they couldn't fight, separated by barriers they couldn't overcome. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't fight the medical device industry directly, not with their resources and political connections. But he could do something they wouldn't expect, something that would expose their campaign for what it really was. He was going to tell the truth, publicly and completely, regardless of the consequences. The video Marcus uploaded to a medical research platform was simple and devastating. No fancy graphics, no corporate polish, just a father sitting in his garage workshop, explaining what had really happened to his invention and his family. "My name is Marcus Chen," he began, looking directly into the camera. 2 years ago, I invented a device that could help autistic children communicate with their families. Today I want to tell you why that device will never reach the children who need it." He laid out the entire story methodically, From the initial inspiration to the clinical trials, to the corporate pressure campaign that had destroyed his work. He showed the FDA complaint, read excerpts from the anonymous online attacks, and explained how the medical device industry was using regulatory and media manipulation to suppress competing technologies. But the most powerful part of the video came when Daniel and David appeared on camera. Marcus had set up the neural bridge protocol one final time, despite the FDA investigation, to demonstrate what the twins were capable of when given the tools to communicate. "This is David," Marcus said as his son worked on a complex three-dimensional puzzle. The device translated his neural patterns in real time, showing thoughts like, "Father is sad but trying to be strong," and "want to help father but don't know how." Then came Daniel, drawing at his easel while the device captured his impressions. Colors singing together appeared on the screen, followed by "family broken, need to fix," and finally, heartbreakingly, "love daddy, want voices to work." The video concluded with Marcus addressing the camera directly, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "These are my sons. They're brilliant, creative, emotionally complex human beings who happen to process the world differently than you and I do. The Neural Bridge Protocol could help thousands of children like them find their voices, but it will never happen as long as corporate profits matter more than human connection." He paused, looking at something off camera, then continued. "I'm releasing all of my research, all of my code, all of my documentation into the public domain. Anyone who wants to build on this work, improve it, or distribute it freely is welcome to do so. The medical device industry can suppress one inventor, but they can't suppress an idea whose time has come." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been viewed thousands of times and shared across social media platforms. Medical researchers, autism advocates, and families dealing with communication challenges began downloading Marcus's open-source files and examining his work. But more importantly, the video sparked a broader conversation about corporate control of medical innovation. Journalists began investigating the anonymous complaints and coordinated attacks that had targeted Marcus and his supporters. Researchers shared their own stories of promising technologies that had been suppressed or controlled by industry interests. Dr. Rodriguez found herself at the center of a media storm as reporters sought to verify Marcus's claims about corporate interference. Her reputation as a respected researcher gave credibility to his allegations, and her detailed documentation of the clinical trials provided scientific support for the Neural Bridge Protocol's effectiveness. "What happened to Marcus Chen is not unique," she told a prominent medical journalist. "It's part of a systematic pattern of suppressing innovations that might reduce profits for established companies. The autism community deserves better than technologies that are priced out of reach or buried in regulatory limbo." The Hawthorne Foundation faced a difficult decision. Supporting Marcus publicly would likely intensify the attacks against them, but abandoning him would validate the corporate pressure campaign and discourage other inventors from pursuing humanitarian technologies. James Hawthorne made the choice that defined his legacy. At a press conference 3 days after Marcus's video went viral, he announced that the foundation would not only continue funding the Neural Bridge Protocol development, but would also establish a legal defense fund for inventors facing corporate retaliation. "The medical device industry is trying to criminalize innovation," Hawthorne declared to a room full of reporters and cameras. "They're using regulatory capture and media manipulation to protect their monopolies at the expense of vulnerable patients and families. The Hawthorne Foundation will not be intimidated into abandoning our mission." The press conference was a turning point in the battle for the Neural Bridge Protocol. Hawthorne's public support gave other foundation board members the courage to speak out, and Maria Santos delivered a particularly powerful statement about the attacks on her family. "They violated my son's privacy and attacked my fitness as a mother because I dared to support a technology that could help him communicate," she said, her voice strong despite the obvious emotion. "That's not legitimate scientific skepticism. That's corporate bullying, and it has to stop." The media coverage began to shift as journalists investigated the sources of the anonymous attacks and regulatory complaints. A technology reporter for a major newspaper traced the online disinformation campaign to a public relations firm known for representing pharmaceutical and medical device companies. The firm's client list included Synapse Dynamics and several other companies that would be threatened by widespread adoption of the neural bridge protocol. Meanwhile, the FDA investigation into Marcus's work began to fall apart under scrutiny. Dr. Rodriguez's meticulous documentation of the clinical trials showed that every ethical guideline had been followed, every participant had provided informed consent, and no adverse events had occurred. The anonymous complaint that had triggered the investigation appeared to be based on deliberate misrepresentations of the research. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Robert Walsh's daughter and a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, had been quietly investigating the corporate pressure campaign against autism communication technologies. Her findings, published in a prestigious medical ethics journal, documented a pattern of industry interference that went far beyond Marcus's case. The suppression of the neural bridge protocol is part of a broader effort to control innovation in the autism treatment space, Dr. Walsh wrote. Companies are using regulatory capture, patent manipulation, and targeted harassment to maintain artificial scarcity and high prices for communication technologies. This represents a fundamental violation of research ethics and patient welfare. Her article included internal documents from medical device companies that explicitly discuss strategies for suppressing competing technologies. One memo from Synapse Dynamics referred to the neural bridge protocol as a, quote, existential threat to market positioning and outlined plans for regulatory interference and reputation management to prevent its commercialization. The revelations created a scandal that extended far beyond Marcus's personal situation. Congressional representatives began calling for investigations into corporate manipulation of medical device regulation. Patient advocacy groups demanded reforms to prevent industry interference with promising treatments. Medical journals published editorials condemning the use of regulatory processes as weapons against innovation. Victoria Marsh, the Synapse Dynamics executive who had threatened Marcus months earlier, found herself testifying before a House subcommittee about her company's efforts to suppress competing technologies. Under oath, she was forced to admit that Synapse had hired public relations firms to discredit the neural bridge protocol and had lobbied regulatory agencies to investigate Marcus's work. We had legitimate concerns about safety and efficacy, she insisted, but her testimony was undermined by the internal documents that showed her company's real motivations. The FDA quietly dropped its investigation into Marcus's research, acknowledging that the original complaint had been based on incomplete and misleading information. The agency's director issued a rare public statement condemning the misuse of regulatory processes to suppress legitimate research. But perhaps the most satisfying vindication came from the autism community itself. Families who had been turned against the neural bridge protocol by the disinformation campaign began demanding access to the technology once they understood what had really happened. Autism advocacy groups that had distanced themselves from Marcus's work issued public apologies and pledged their support for open-source medical innovation. The online attacks that had seemed so devastating months earlier were revealed as coordinated propaganda, and the autism community's anger shifted toward the companies that had manipulated them. Social media platforms that had been flooded with anti-neural bridge protocol posts were now filled with demands for corporate accountability and medical justice. Marcus watched these developments from his garage workshop, amazed at how quickly the narrative had shifted once the truth became public. The device that had been branded as dangerous experimental technology was now celebrated as a breakthrough innovation that had been suppressed by corporate greed. But the real validation came from his sons. As the FDA investigation ended and the legal restrictions were lifted, Marcus was able to resume his work on the neural bridge protocol. The first session in months brought tears to his eyes as Daniel and David's thoughts appeared on the screen again. "Daddy is happy." David's translation read, "Daddy is strong again." Daniel's patterns showed even more sophisticated understanding. "Bad people tried to stop our voices, but good people helped Daddy fight back." The boys had understood more than anyone realized, had been aware of the battle raging around them and their father's struggle to protect his invention. Their faith in him had never wavered, even when his own confidence had crumbled under corporate pressure. Sarah joined them in the garage that evening, watching as the twins communicated through the device that had caused so much turmoil and ultimately brought their family closer together. "What happens now?" she asked, her arm around Marcus's shoulders. Marcus looked at the neural bridge protocol humming softly on his workbench, then at his sons engaged in their first real conversation in months. The device was no longer just his invention. It belonged to the open-source community now, free from corporate control and available to anyone with the skills and resources to build on his work. "Now we change the world," he said quietly, one voice at a time. The battle for the neural bridge protocol was over, but the war for medical innovation had just begun. Marcus Chen had started as a desperate father trying to help his autistic sons communicate. He had become something he never expected, a symbol of resistance against corporate control of human dignity. And in laboratories and workshops around the world, other inventors were downloading his files, studying his methods, and building their own versions of hope. The neural bridge protocol would never belong to any company. But more importantly, the revelations triggered a broader reckoning within the medical device industry. Companies that had participated in or benefited from the suppression network found themselves under federal investigation. Stock prices plummeted as investors realized the legal and reputational risks of systematic innovation suppression. The autism community's reaction was swift and furious. Advocacy groups that had been manipulated into opposing the neural bridge protocol issued statements condemning corporate interference with medical research. Parents who had been turned against Marcus's work demanded access to the technology their children needed. Maria Santos, whose son Miguel had been used as a weapon against her credibility, found herself at the center of a movement demanding corporate accountability in medical research. "They violated my child's privacy and attacked my family to protect their profits," she said at a packed press conference. "Every family dealing with autism deserves to know how we've been manipulated and exploited." The media coverage was relentless. Investigative journalists who had initially been skeptical of Marcus's claims now competed to expose additional examples of corporate malfeasance. The story had everything: David versus Goliath heroics, corporate villains, and vulnerable children caught in the crossfire of greed and innovation. But for Marcus, the most meaningful vindication came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a researcher at Johns Hopkins who had been working on similar communication technologies, revealed that her own work had been systematically suppressed through the same network that had targeted the neural bridge protocol. "I thought I was the only one," she said during a joint interview with Marcus. "My device uses different technology, but it could help the same population of children. For 3 years, I've faced patent challenges, regulatory complaints, and funding difficulties that I couldn't understand. Now, I know why." Dr. Foster's revelation led to a flood of similar stories from researchers around the world. The suppression network had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined, targeting dozens of promising technologies that could have helped autistic individuals and their families. The collective impact of these suppressed innovations was staggering. If the neural bridge protocol and similar devices had been allowed to develop naturally, thousands of children might already be communicating with their families. Instead, they remained trapped behind barriers that corporate greed had artificially maintained. Marcus found himself transformed from isolated inventor to leader of a movement he had never intended to start. Researchers, advocates, and families looked to him for guidance on fighting corporate interference with medical innovation. The responsibility was overwhelming, but he drew strength from remembering why he had started this journey. The congressional hearings that followed were must-watch television for anyone interested in medical ethics and corporate accountability. Victoria Marsh and her co-conspirators were called to testify about their roles in suppressing autism communication technologies, and their attempts to justify their actions only deepened public outrage. "We had legitimate concerns about safety and market stability," Marsh insisted, her composure cracking under intense questioning from representatives who had been briefed on the recorded conversations and internal documents. Representative Sarah Chen of California, who had an autistic grandson, was particularly devastating in her questioning. "Ms. Marsh, I'm looking at an email you sent that says, 'The Chen device must be stopped at all costs, even if it means destroying his family.' Can you explain how destroying a family serves safety concerns?" Marsh's stammered response about protecting patients from unproven treatments was undermined by evidence that her company had never conducted independent safety testing of the neural bridge protocol. Their opposition had, now. It belonged to every child who needed a voice, every family seeking connection, every researcher committed to putting human welfare above corporate profits. The medical device industry had tried to bury Marcus's invention, but they had made a critical error. They had attacked not just a technology, but the love of a father for his children. And that love, once awakened and armed with truth, had proven more powerful than all their money and influence combined. The phone call that would change everything came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, jerking Marcus from restless sleep. He fumbled for his phone, expecting another reporter or researcher wanting to discuss the neural bridge protocol. Instead, he heard James Hawthorne's voice, tighter with excitement than Marcus had ever heard it. "Marcus, you need to see the news. Turn on Channel 7, right now." Marcus stumbled to the living room and clicked on the television, Sarah following behind him with worried eyes. The morning news anchor was speaking about corporate fraud investigations, and Marcus felt his stomach clench, fearing another attack on his work. But then, the anchor said words that made the room spin around him. "Rite" resulted in federal charges against 3 executives from Synapse Dynamics and related companies for conspiracy to suppress medical technologies and manipulate federal regulatory processes. The screen filled with footage of Victoria Marsh being led from the Synapse Dynamics headquarters in handcuffs, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. The reporter's voiceover explained that a federal grand jury had indicted her and 2 other executives for criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and violations of medical device regulations. The investigation was triggered by revelations about the systematic suppression of autism communication technologies, the reporter continued, including attempts to prevent the commercialization of a device invented by engineer Marcus Chen that could help autistic children communicate with their families. Marcus sank onto the couch, hardly believing what he was seeing. The corporate executives who had seemed so untouchable, who had wielded federal agencies like weapons against his family, were now facing serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. Sarah gripped his hand tightly as the report continued. The investigation had uncovered a vast network of corporate coordination designed to suppress medical innovations that threatened established profit margins. Internal communications revealed explicit strategies for using regulatory harassment, media manipulation, and legal intimidation to destroy competing technologies. But the most damaging evidence came from wiretapped phone conversations between Synapse executives and their hired public relations firms. The recordings captured Victoria Marsh explicitly ordering the anonymous attacks on Marcus's reputation and the coordinated campaign to turn the autism community against his work. "I don't care what it costs," Marsh could be heard saying in one recording. "I want this Chen character destroyed professionally and personally. His device threatens everything we've built in the autism market. Make sure he never recovers from this." The callousness in her voice, the casual discussion of destroying a family's life to protect corporate profits, had shocked even the prosecutors who had heard worse during their careers. When played for the grand jury, the recordings had led to immediate indictments. Dr. Rodriguez called minutes after the news report ended, her voice alive with vindication and anger. "I hope they throw the book at every one of them," she said. "What they did to your family, to all those families who could have benefited from your device, it's unconscionable." The criminal charges were just the beginning. Within hours, civil lawsuits were filed on behalf of Marcus and other inventors who had been targeted by similar corporate suppression campaigns. The Hawthorne Foundation announced a major legal initiative to recover damages and prevent future attacks on medical innovation, then purely financial, based on market projections that showed massive profit losses if communication technologies became widely available and affordable. The hearings revealed not just the specific conspiracy against Marcus's work, but a broader pattern of corporate control over medical innovation that had persisted for decades. Witness after witness testified about promising treatments that had been buried, researchers who had been silenced, and patients who had been denied access to technologies that could improve their lives. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, now serving as a special advisor to the Department of Health and Human Services, used the hearings to announce major reforms to medical device regulation. "The system has been captured by the very industry it's supposed to regulate," she declared. "We're implementing new protections for independent researchers and streamlined approval processes for humanitarian technologies." The policy changes were comprehensive. Anonymous complaints to federal agencies would no longer be accepted without verifiable sources. Medical device companies would be required to disclose their involvement in challenging competing technologies. And most importantly, a new fast-track approval process would be established for innovations that addressed unmet medical needs in underserved populations. But even as justice was being served in courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms, Marcus remained focused on the technology that had started everything. The neural bridge protocol was now being developed by research teams around the world, each building on his open-source foundation to create their own improvements and adaptations. The device that sat on his garage workbench looked identical to the one he had built 2 years earlier, but its capabilities had expanded dramatically. Collaboration with other researchers had led to improvements in accuracy, new applications for different types of communication challenges, and manufacturing techniques that could produce the devices at a fraction of the original cost. Daniel and David, now 9 years old, had become unofficial ambassadors for the technology. Their regular sessions with the Neural Bridge Protocol were documented and shared with researchers studying autism communication, and their insights had led to several important improvements in the translation algorithms. The twins' personalities had blossomed as their ability to communicate expanded. David revealed himself to be not just a puzzle solver but a philosopher, offering profound observations about mathematics, patterns, and the nature of consciousness. Daniel's artistic vision had found expression through the device, allowing him to share the synesthetic experiences that colored his perception of the world. "Sound has colors," he had told Marcus through the device during a recent session. "Music makes shapes that dance in my mind. I want to paint the songs I see." These insights had revolutionized understanding of autism as a neurological difference rather than a deficiency. Children using various versions of the Neural Bridge Protocol were revealing forms of intelligence and creativity that had been hidden by communication barriers. The medical community was beginning to recognize autism as a source of cognitive diversity, rather than just a collection of challenges to be overcome. The first commercial versions of communication devices based on Marcus's work were scheduled to become available within 6 months. True to his original vision, they would be sold on a sliding scale basis, with no family excluded due to financial constraints. The Hawthorne Foundation had established a global distribution network that would make the technology available even in developing countries. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the collapse of the artificial scarcity that had characterized the autism treatment industry. With multiple open-source communication technologies now available, established companies could no longer maintain their monopolistic pricing. Even Synapse Dynamics, struggling to survive the criminal convictions of its leadership, had been forced to dramatically reduce the costs of their existing products. The market transformation was exactly what Marcus had hoped for when he first decided to release his technology into the public domain. Competition and innovation were driving prices down and quality up, making communication assistance accessible to families who had never been able to afford it before. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Marcus sat in his garage workshop with Daniel and David, watching them use the latest version of the Neural Bridge Protocol to have what could only be described as a conversation. Their thoughts appeared on twin screens, a flowing dialogue about consciousness, creativity, and their dreams for the future. "Will other kids like us get to talk with these devices?" David's translation asked. "Already happening," Marcus typed back. "Children all over the world are finding their voices." Daniel's response captured the profound impact of their journey. "Daddy made voices for silent children. Bad people tried to stop voices. Good people helped voices grow everywhere." Sarah joined them, carrying cups of hot chocolate and wearing the peaceful expression that had replaced the worry lines of the previous years. The garage had been transformed from a desperate workshop into a center of innovation, with researchers and engineers regularly visiting to collaborate on new applications for neural communication technology. "Any regrets?" she asked Marcus as they watched their son's digital conversation continue. Marcus considered the question seriously. The past 3 years had brought more stress, conflict, and uncertainty than he had ever imagined possible. His family had been attacked, his reputation destroyed and rebuilt, and his peaceful life as an engineer completely upended. But then he looked at the screens showing his son's thought about the thousands of families around the world who were experiencing similar moments of connection for the first time, and considered the corporate executives now facing prison time for their crimes against human dignity. "None," he said firmly. "Not a single one." The Neural Bridge Protocol hummed softly on the workbench, its LED indicators pulsing gently as it processed the complex neural patterns of 2 brilliant children who had finally found their voices. Soon, similar devices would be humming in homes and schools and therapy centers around the world, carrying the hopes and dreams and innermost thoughts of children who had been waiting their entire lives to be heard. Marcus Chen had started this journey as a father, trying to help his autistic sons. He had become something he never expected, a catalyst for transformation in how society understood and supported neurological diversity. The medical device industry had tried to silence him, but they had only succeeded in amplifying his message and spreading his technology far beyond what any single company could have achieved. The revolution in autism communication was just beginning, and it would be led not by corporate executives motivated by profit, but by families motivated by love, researchers motivated by curiosity, and inventors motivated by the simple belief that every human being deserved to be heard. 5 years later, Marcus Chen stood before an audience of 2,000 people at the International Conference on Neurological Innovation, but his eyes were fixed on 2 young teenagers sitting in the front row. Daniel and David, now 13, had insisted on attending the keynote address where their father would receive the Humanitarian Technology Award for his work on autism communication devices. The boys looked like any other teenagers, casually dressed and occasionally whispering to each other, but Marcus knew they were communicating through the latest generation of neural bridge devices, now so small and elegant they were virtually invisible. The technology that had begun in a cluttered garage had evolved into something that looked more like fashionable jewelry than medical equipment. "When I first built the neural bridge protocol," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the vast auditorium, "I thought I was just trying to help my 2 sons communicate with their family. I had no idea I was about to challenge an entire industry's assumptions about human consciousness and corporate responsibility." The audience included researchers, advocates, families, and even former executives from companies that had once opposed his work. Synapse Dynamics had been dissolved following the criminal convictions of its leadership, its assets distributed to victims of corporate suppression campaigns. Victoria Marsh was serving a 7-year federal sentence for conspiracy and fraud. But Marcus wasn't focused on past victories. He was looking toward a future where neurological differences were celebrated rather than pathologized, where communication barriers were seen as engineering challenges rather than permanent limitations. Today, over 40,000 children and adults worldwide use some version of neural communication technology based on open-source designs, he continued. They're not just speaking for the first time. They're teaching us new ways to think about consciousness, creativity, and human potential. The statistics were remarkable, but they only told part of the story. The real impact was visible in families like the Johnsons from Seattle, whose daughter Emma had used a neural bridge device to reveal her fascination with quantum physics at age 8, or the Garcias from Mexico City, whose son Carlos had composed symphonies that existed only in his neural patterns until the technology gave them voice. Dr. Rodriguez, now heading the Autism Communication Research Institute that had grown from their original collaboration, took the stage to present the award. "Marcus Chen didn't just invent a device," she said. "He sparked a revolution in how we understand and support neurological diversity." The institute had become a global hub for research into consciousness and communication, attracting scientists and inventors from around the world. Their latest project involved developing neural interfaces for individuals with traumatic brain injuries, stroke victims, and people with degenerative neurological conditions. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a new generation of autistic researchers and inventors who were using neural communication technology to contribute their own insights to the field. David Chen had become the youngest person ever admitted to MIT's neuroscience program, while Daniel was revolutionizing digital art through his unique synesthetic perspective. The next phase of this work won't be led by neurotypical researchers studying autism from the outside, Marcus said as he accepted the Crystal Award. It will be led by autistic individuals themselves, sharing their perspectives and designing technologies that truly serve their communities. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus's attention was drawn to movement in the front row. Daniel and David had stood up, their faces shining with pride and something else. Their neural bridge devices were active, and Marcus could see translations appearing on the small displays they wore. "Our Father gave us voices," David's device showed. "Now we give voices to others." Daniel's translation was characteristically poetic: silent children singing, wisdom waiting, world listening finally. As the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, Marcus was surrounded by families, researchers, and advocates wanting to share their own stories of transformation. But his most meaningful conversation was with a young girl named Amy, who approached with her parents and her own neural bridge device. "Mr. Chen," Her device translated as she looked up at him with bright, intelligent eyes. "I want to be an inventor like you when I grow up. I have ideas for helping people who think differently." Marcus knelt down to her level, remembering another little girl who had once struggled to communicate her brilliant thoughts. What kind of ideas? Amy's device glowed as it processed her response. "Devices that help people see the colors and sound like I do. Machines that translate feelings into music. Tools that show the beauty in different minds." Her parents watched with tears in their eyes as their daughter, once considered severely disabled, discussed her plans to become a biomedical engineer. The Neural Bridge Protocol had not only given Amy a voice, but revealed her profound understanding of human consciousness and her desire to help others. That evening, Marcus sat with his family in their hotel room, looking out at the city lights, while Daniel and David shared their thoughts about the day's events through their devices. The conversation ranged from quantum mechanics to digital art, to the philosophical implications of machine-mediated consciousness. "Do you think we'll be remembered for the right reasons?" Sarah asked, her arm around Marcus's shoulders. "I think we'll be remembered for love," Marcus replied, watching his sons. Thoughts flow across their screens in words that would have been forever trapped in silence, without the technology born from desperation and hope. Outside their window, the city hummed with millions of voices, most of them speaking in traditional ways. But scattered throughout the urban landscape were thousands of neural bridge devices, giving voice to thoughts that had never been heard before, carrying dreams and insights that were reshaping human understanding of consciousness itself. The revolution Marcus had accidentally started was no longer about autism or communication devices. It had become something larger, a transformation in how society valued different forms of intelligence and different ways of experiencing the world. Children who might once have been written off as severely impaired were now recognized as profound thinkers with unique perspectives on reality. Families who had lost hope were discovering that their loved ones had been trying to communicate all along, just in languages the world hadn't learned to hear. And in laboratories and workshops around the globe, a new generation of inventors was building on Marcus's foundation, creating technologies that celebrated neurological diversity rather than trying to eliminate it. The medical device industry that had once tried to suppress his work was now scrambling to adapt to a world where open-source innovation and humanitarian values had proven more powerful than corporate control and artificial scarcity. As Marcus drifted off to sleep that night, he thought about the garage workshop where it all began, about two silent 8-year-olds who had needed their father to build them voices, about the corporate executives who had tried to steal those voices for profit. Most of all, he thought about the future Daniel and David would help create, a world where being different was recognized as being valuable, where every form of consciousness was honored and supported. The Neural Bridge Protocol had started as one father's desperate attempt to connect with his children. It had become humanity's bridge to understanding forms of intelligence that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. And tomorrow, in homes and schools and research centers around the world, thousands of devices would hum softly as they carried new voices into the light, each one proof that love, determination, and open hearts could overcome any obstacle that greed and fear might construct. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.